My dad cut me off at 19 and told me I'd be back in 6 months begging. I showed up 9 years later to his retirement party. My father is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that up front because this story could easily read like an indictment of him, and that is not what I am going for. He is complicated, and he raised me with a very specific set of beliefs about how a life should be structured, what success looks like, how a man measures himself, and those beliefs caused real damage to our relationship over many years. But he is not a villain. He is someone who grew up without much, built something substantial through discipline and sacrifice, and then made the mistake that a lot of self-made people make, which is assuming that the path they took is the only valid path, and that anyone who chooses differently is either naive or lazy or both. He grew up poor in a way that marked him permanently. Not dramatic poverty, not the kind that makes for a compelling documentary, just the steady grinding kind where there was never quite enough and where money was a source of constant anxiety in the household. He watched his father work physical jobs his whole life and retire with very little to show for it, and he decided early that he was going to do something different. He went into accounting, built his way up over decades, became a partner at a mid-sized firm, and by the time I was growing up we were solidly comfortable. Not wealthy in an excessive way, but comfortable in the way where you do not worry about the basics and can afford to take a vacation once a year and replace the car when it gets old. I am the oldest of two. My brother Marcus is 4 years younger than me and is, by every external measure, the son my father wanted. Not because Marcus is some perfect person, but because Marcus and my dad are built similarly. They are both practical, both numbers-oriented, both motivated by security and stability in a way that expresses itself as career focus. Marcus became a financial analyst. He bought a house at 27. He has a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan and probably a 20-year plan laminated somewhere. My dad loves him in a way that has always been easy and uncomplicated, and I do not say that with resentment toward Marcus, because Marcus is a good person and genuinely my friend. I say it only because understanding the contrast matters for understanding what happened between my father and me. From the time I was about 15, it was clear to everyone in the family that I was not wired the way my dad wanted me to be. I was not a troubled kid. I was not getting into trouble or failing school. I was doing fine academically, had friends, was reasonably well adjusted. But my interests pulled in directions that my father did not take seriously. I was interested in design. Specifically visual communication, the way things look and feel, the way a well-constructed image or layout can carry meaning that words sometimes cannot. I spent hours on the computer working on things that had no practical justification in my dad's framework. I read about designers I admired. I taught myself software. By the time I was 17, I was doing small freelance projects for people I found online, nothing significant money-wise, but real work that real people were paying for. My dad knew about this in the vague way parents know about things their teenagers do when they are not paying close attention. He did not take it seriously because he did not believe it was serious. When conversations came up about college and the future, he steered consistently toward business, accounting, finance, something with a clear and recognizable career track. I pushed back, not aggressively but persistently, saying I wanted to study graphic design or visual arts or something in that direction. He told me more than once that people who go to school for art end up working at coffee shops. That was not a dig at people who work at coffee shops, he would clarify, but it was not a direction he was willing to fund. The actual breaking point did not happen over one conversation. It built over the course of my senior year and the summer before college, a series of arguments that escalated in intensity and then would cool down and then escalate again. I had gotten into a program I was genuinely excited about, a design school with a solid reputation, and when I brought the acceptance letter home my dad looked at it for a long time and then put it down on the kitchen counter and said he would not pay for it. Not that he could not. That he would not. He said he would pay for 4 years at a state university if I chose a practical major. He would cover room, board, tuition, and a reasonable living stipend. He laid it out like a business arrangement, which was very much his style. I told him I did not want to study something I had no interest in for 4 years. He told me that feelings about your major did not determine your financial security. I told him that I believed I could build a real career doing what I was actually good at and genuinely wanted to do. He told me that was the thing every 20-year-old who ends up broke at 40 tells themselves. We went back and forth like this for weeks. My mother stayed mostly quiet, which was her way of managing her position between us. She agreed with me privately and agreed with him privately, which is a difficult thing to watch your parent do, but also something I have come to understand better as I have gotten older. The final conversation happened in August, about 3 weeks before I would have needed to move into a dorm somewhere. My dad sat me down and told me his position had not changed and was not going to change. He would fund a practical education or he would fund nothing. I sat there and listened to everything he said, and when he was finished I told him I was going to the design program. I had already applied for financial aid and taken out what loans I could access independently. I had saved a few $1,000s from freelance work over the past couple of years. I was not going to be comfortable, but I believed I could make it work. My dad looked at me for a long time after I said that. Not with anger or not primarily with anger. It was more like a very settled disappointment, the expression of someone who has already determined the outcome and is watching events confirm what they knew. He told me that I was making a serious mistake. He told me that the real world did not care about passion. He told me that in 6 months, when I had burned through my savings and maxed my financial aid and the freelance work had dried up, I would come back, and he hoped I would not be too proud to accept help when I did. I told him I would not be coming back. He did not respond to that. I left the room, and 3 weeks later I left for school. The first year was genuinely difficult in a way I had not fully anticipated. I had enough to cover tuition with the financial aid and loans, but the living situation required creativity. I found the cheapest room I could in a shared house about 2 miles from campus, for people in a place that was really sized for 2, and I made it work. I ate cheap. I worked whatever jobs I could fit around my class schedule, which at different points included working at a print shop, doing delivery on weekends, and continuing to pick up freelance design work wherever I could find it. I was tired a lot. I was sometimes stressed in the specific way that comes from watching your bank account sit at a number that gives you very little margin for anything unexpected. I talked to my mom maybe once every week or 2. She would call from her cell phone at times when I knew my dad would not be in the room. I did not ask her to do that, and she never explained it. It was just how it worked. She would ask how I was doing, and I would tell her honestly, and she would tell me about things at home, and we would talk about normal things the way parents and kids do. She never pressured me to come back or to reconsider or to call my dad. She just kept the line open, and that meant more to me than I ever told her at the time. My dad and I had almost no contact for the first 2 years. There were 2 phone calls, both stilted and brief, both ending in the same place they started, which was a polite surface-level distance that felt worse in some ways than outright conflict. I had not gone back. He had not reached out in any real way. The 6 months he had predicted came and went, and then a year, and then 2, and nothing collapsed the way he had said it would. I got through school. It took me 4.5 years rather than 4 because I had to reduce my course load in certain semesters when work became essential, but I finished. I graduated with a portfolio I was proud of and a clear sense of what I wanted to do, which was brand identity work, the specific discipline of helping companies and organizations figure out how they present themselves visually. It is more technical and strategic than most people imagine when they think about graphic design, and I had spent my time in school and in the small freelance projects I had been doing developing a genuine skill set in that area. The 2 years after graduation were a different kind of hard. Not survival hard like school had been, but the specific frustration of being competent and motivated and still not breaking through to the level you are working toward. I took a junior position at a small agency and learned how the business side of design actually functions, how clients are managed, how projects are scoped and priced, how the gap between good work and getting paid for good work is navigated. I was not making impressive money. I was making enough, which was different from what I had made in school but still modest by any external measure. My relationship with my dad in these years was a kind of managed distance. We would see each other at family things, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the occasional birthday. We were polite. We did not fight because we did not engage deeply enough to fight. He never asked about my work in a way that suggested real curiosity, and I never volunteered information in a way that felt like I was performing for his approval. My mother moved between us carefully, keeping both relationships functional, probably working harder than she should have had to. The shift in my professional life started happening in my late 20s. I had left the agency after 3 years and started doing independent brand consulting, which was a risk that took about a year to start paying off and then started paying off considerably. I had built enough of a reputation through the agency work and through referrals that I was getting clients who had real budgets and real needs, not the small local businesses that had been my early client base, but mid-sized companies and a few larger ones going through rebranding processes. The kind of work where the fee for a single project was more than I had made in an entire year when I first graduated. I am not going to give you specific numbers because it does not feel necessary, and also because the point of this story is not the money is just evidence of the larger thing. What I will say is that by the time I was 28, I was doing well by any reasonable standard. I had a one-bedroom apartment I actually liked, not aspirational but genuinely comfortable. I had savings that gave me the feeling of solidity that I had not had through most of my 20s. I was doing work I found genuinely engaging with clients I respected, and some of those clients were beginning to refer me to others in their networks, which is how independent consulting actually grows. I thought about my dad periodically, not with sustained bitterness, more the way you think about a place you lived once that is connected to a complicated chapter. I had spent a lot of energy in my early 20s being angry, and then less energy being disappointed, and then eventually arriving somewhere closer to understanding. He had been wrong about the specific prediction, but I also understood now, better than I had at 19, why he had believed it. He had watched people around him make choices he considered impractical and seen those choices lead to difficulty. He was applying a pattern that had meaning in his experience. He was not right about me, but he was not entirely irrational either. My mom called me in January of the year I was 28. She told me my dad was retiring in the spring. He was 67, had been at the firm for over 30 years, and the partners were throwing him a retirement party. She told me she wanted me to be there. I asked her whether my dad wanted me there. She paused in a way that was its own kind of answer, and then she said she had already put my name on the guest list and that she needed me to come, and that she would handle the rest. I said I would think about it. A week later I told her I would come. The party was held at a private room in a restaurant that the firm used for client events. It was a Friday evening in April, maybe 60 people, a mix of colleagues and partners and their spouses and some family. My mom had sent me the details and I had arranged to fly in the day before and stay at a hotel nearby rather than at the house, which felt like the right call for a number of reasons. I got there about 20 minutes after the start time, which was intentional. I did not want to be standing near the entrance when the main wave of guests arrived. I checked my coat, got a drink, and spent a few minutes getting my bearings. The room was full. The noise level was the comfortable hum of a party where people know each other, and I was looking around trying to spot my mom when I heard my name. It was my Uncle Raymond, my dad's younger brother, who I had not seen in about 3 years. He came over with the energy of someone genuinely glad to see me and grabbed my hand and shook it. He told me I looked good. I told him he did too. And then he said something that I was not prepared for. He said, "So things are going better these days?" I looked at him. He said, "Your dad mentioned you had a rough stretch but that you'd been getting back on your feet. Said you were picking up some small jobs here and there, getting stabilized." I stood there for a moment and processed what he had just said. That was the moment the shape of everything became clear to me. I had walked into that room as myself, as the person I had actually become over 9 years, and I was apparently walking into a room full of people who had been given an entirely different person. My father, with no real information about what I had been doing and no contact with me that could have told him, had been filling in the blank space of my life with a story. And the story he had told, to his brother, to his colleagues, to whoever else had asked over the years, was the story he had predicted for me at 19. Rough stretch. Getting back on his feet. Small jobs here and there. The version of me that would have confirmed his warning had been the version he reported. He had not done this because he had accurate information. He had done it because he had no information, and because the absence of information, in the framework he was operating from, meant the story had gone the way he expected. I had not come back. I had not called asking for help. And rather than interpret that silence as evidence that I had actually figured it out, he had interpreted it as something too difficult to discuss. So he had quietly built a narrative, not malicious exactly, maybe even partly protective of himself, and circulated it over the years to the people around him. And he had been doing this for 9 years. I smiled at my Uncle Raymond and told him I appreciated him asking, but that I was actually doing quite well. He looked at me with a slight shift in his expression, the particular confusion of someone who is recalibrating. I told him, specifically and without embellishment, what I did for work, what the past few years had looked like professionally, and what I was working on currently. I was not aggressive about it. I was not performing. I talked about it the way I would talk about it to anyone, as a normal conversation about my job. His expression changed slowly as I talked, in the way that expressions do when someone realizes the picture they have been holding does not match the one in front of them. He said, "Well, that does not sound like what I had been hearing at all." I said, "I imagine not." He did not have anything immediately to say after that, and neither did I, and the conversation shifted. I found my mother, and she hugged me for a long time and asked how I was doing and looked at my face to see for herself. She knew none of this would be simple, and I think she had been carrying some anxiety about the evening. I told her I was fine, and I meant it. I was actually fine. I was not dreading anything. I was mostly curious about how the rest of the night would unfold. My father saw me from across the room about half an hour in. He was standing with two colleagues when his eyes found me, and I saw him process it in real time, the recognition, the slight still before he recovered and resumed the conversation he was in. We did not immediately go to each other. The room moved us around the way rooms do, and it was probably 45 minutes after I arrived before we were standing in the same space. He looked older than I had expected. Not in a bad way, in the way that 9 years will make itself visible on a person. He looked like someone who had worked hard for a long time and was at the end of that chapter. There was something in his posture that was different from what I remembered, something slightly less rigid. He said my name. I said his. He told me I came. I told him my mom asked me to and I wanted to be there. He looked at me in the careful way people look when they are trying to read something. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was well. He asked about work. And I told him. Not to wound him, not to make a point in a sharp way, just honestly and directly because he had asked. I told him what I had been doing for the past several years, what the work looked like now, what my life had settled into. I watched his face as I talked. He did not interrupt. He listened in the way my father rarely listened, fully, without preparing his response. When I stopped talking, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said he had not known any of that. I told him I was aware of that. He said he had thought, and he paused here in a way that was uncharacteristic for him. He said he had thought things had been hard for me. I told him that things had been hard, especially early on, but that I had gotten through that and built something I was proud of. He nodded very slowly. He did not apologize. That is not who he is, or at least not who he is yet, and I was not standing there expecting one. What he said after a moment was that he was glad to hear it. And the thing about that is that I believed him. He was not performing gladness. He was a man who had spent 9 years with a story in his head, a story that confirmed his worldview and maybe quietly hurt him more than he ever acknowledged. And he was standing in front of evidence that the story was wrong, and what he felt about that was genuinely complicated. I could see it. We talked for another 20 minutes, longer than we had talked in years, and it was not a healed conversation, it was not a movie reconciliation. It was two people who had been distant for a long time making careful and honest contact. When it ended, we went back to the party separately, and that was fine. There is a specific thing that happened later in the evening that I keep coming back to. I was talking near the bar with a couple of my dad's colleagues when his partner Richard, who had been at the firm almost as long as my dad, came over and introduced himself and asked if I was the son. I said I was. He said he had heard I was in creative work. I said that was right. He asked what kind and I told him, and he immediately had real questions because Richard, it turned out, was on the board of a non-profit that had been looking for someone to help them redesign their brand materials for a fundraising campaign. We ended up talking for almost half an hour. We exchanged information before the night was over. We started working together 2 months later. The project went well. It has since led to 2 other referrals through that network. The way I ended up at my father's retirement party, having an accidental professional conversation that led to actual work, through a path that started with him predicting my failure and circulating that prediction for 9 years, is something I genuinely do not have the language to fully process. It is not ironic in a neat way. It is just complicated and very human, and I have thought about it a lot. My father and I are in contact now with some regularity. We are not close the way I imagine fathers and sons can be when things go well from the beginning, and I do not know if we will ever fully recover what the distance cost us. But he has asked about my work, real questions, more than once since that night. He met a client I was particularly proud of and shook the man's hand and introduced himself as my father, and there was something in the way he said it that I had not heard before. My mom cried when I told her about the conversation with Richard at the bar. Not dramatically, just a few tears that she wiped away quickly and then laughed at herself for. She said she had always known it would come back around. I told her she was more confident than I had been. She said that was a mother's job. I went home 2 days after the party. I flew back to my apartment, went back to my work, called a couple of clients who had things in progress, and had dinner with a friend that evening. My life was the same life it had been before the party. Nothing dramatic had changed, but something had settled. Some unresolved tension that I had been carrying so long it had started to feel like a permanent feature. The story my father had told about me was not true. That had always been the case. But now the room full of people who had received that story also knew it was not true. And my father knew that they knew. And somewhere in that shift something released. I do not know what the next few years look like with him. I am not optimistic in an uncritical way because our history is real and the patterns in it are established. But I am also not closed off in the way I had been for most of my 20s, because that takes a kind of sustained energy that I am not interested in spending anymore. He told me he was proud of me as I was leaving the party. It was brief and slightly uncomfortable in the way that long overdue things often are. I thanked him. I did not tell him that his pride was not something I had needed for a long time, because that was true, but it was also not the most important thing to say right then. Instead, I told him it was a good party, and that the restaurant had been a solid choice. He almost smiled at that. I said I would call him, and then I left.